We have today Dr. Saxe from Department of Experimental Psychology from Oxford University. And he also has a PhD of electrical engineering from Stanford University. Hello, Doctor. Thank you for joining us today.
Pleasure.
You can comment whenever you want.
Okay. Thank you very much for the invitation. I hope you're all staying safe and finding ways to enjoy, I guess, working from home. This is a wonderful symposium. What I'd like to talk about today is some work looking at how humans might acquire their semantic knowledge about the world with the help of analyzing deep networks. So semantic cognition, as I am using this term at least, is our ability to use and manipulate our general background knowledge about the world over our lifespan. And this is about knowledge of items and events which go beyond perceptual properties to sort of more complex types of knowledge structures. So, for instance, if you think about what the human concept of a dog is, if you look at an image of a dog, you could show this to a deep neural network of some kind, like maybe AlexNet. An activity would flow through a bunch of layers, and at the top of that deep network, it would say, this is training class number 231, which maybe is a dog. But of course, the human concept of a dog goes well beyond this. So, you know, the deep neural network would also recognize that this is a dog, and that's quite an accomplishment, because if you think about the pixels, the detailed images here, at the pixel level, they share almost nothing. So the deep network has accomplished something quite impressive. You know, dogs come in many different shapes. But ultimately, we know much more about them. We know that dogs have fur. We know that dogs can run. We know that dogs like meat. So that's a property of their mind, right? You're thinking about dogs as an acting agent. They're the kind of being that likes meat. They chase frisbees, and you know things that hopefully you've never seen directly, like that dogs probably have a spleen. So how do we learn these sort of diverse facts about our world? And in fact, you couldn't really talk about the human concept of a dog without putting it into relation with all of the other items out there in the world. So you know that a dog is an animal, and that the animal is the broader class. You know that it's kind of like a wolf, and it's nothing at all like seaweed. So we place our knowledge into these broad structures for a domain. And the process of semantic development is the process by which children and adults slowly extract these domain structures from seeing many individual examples. So it's pretty amazing. A child would only ever see a specific dog, right? Your neighbor's dog, your coworker's horse. And over time, from these specific experiences, they come to understand that there's this more abstract class of a dog and classes for animals and so on. So if our world is characterized by sort of a rich, nested hierarchical structure, how do we acquire this type of knowledge? And what's the dynamics or the time course and pattern of that acquisition? Now, this has been heavily studied in developmental psychology. I'm not going to go through all of these things, but these are just a sampling of some of the empirical phenomena that people have pointed to, developmental psychologists have pointed to. So just to pick out one, the first one, progressive differentiation, is the observation that when children are learning about items, they tend to start with the broadest distinctions. So between animal versus plant, say, before they learn the finer distinctions like dog versus cat or Rottweiler versus golden retriever. So that's one empirical finding. Another one would be category coherence, that some categories just hang together and are learned faster than other categories. For instance, the category of all things that are dogs is somehow much more coherent than the category of all things that are blue. So why is that? And how does that affect learning speed? And there's many others. We like a theory that sort of explains these phenomena. So there are many modeling approaches to this problem. Early approaches tried to explicitly place things into hierarchies using predicate hierarchies. But that was quickly found to be very brittle because it's sort of a binary, 100% yes or no decision on each of these properties. So there was a later influential approach by Kemp and Tenenbaum, where they tried to fit a probabilistic model. So you let things be probabilistic and you fit structures to different domains. But the approach that I'm going to talk about draws on neural networks. So this was an approach that came from the first era of neural networks before they were called deep networks, but they are basically just deep networks. And the idea is that semantic knowledge arises from just slowly learning about the properties of items. So in this neural network, you have an input layer where you see different items in your world. So this network's looking at a canary. And then activity flows through weighted connections with a relation layer. So this network is saying a canary can grow, move, fly, and sing. And there's all of these properties on the output that other items might have to produce. And just a note on this, because sometimes people, I think it's hard to switch their thinking here, is you may be used to deep networks that have complex features on the input and then simple outputs like, am I looking at a canary? This is sort of asking what comes next, right? So suppose you already know you're looking at a canary. Now there's lots of properties and features, semantic features that canary has. So now we have sort of simple inputs and really complexly structured outputs. So what I'll talk about today is an analysis of learning in that model, but simplified a bit further. And then I'll talk about implications for human semantic development. And please feel free to stop me if you have questions. And I can't see the chat, so you have to just barge in if you can. All right, so how can we make progress here? My approach is going to be to study a simple case, because deep networks are very hard to analyze in their full generality. So the simple case is going to be deep linear neural networks. And I'll describe these in detail, but I think particularly in the brain sciences, it's important to make sure that we understand the models that we use. And so the advantage of these simple models is you can get very clear predictions out of them, and they're no longer sort of black boxes. So what is a deep linear network? Well, here is your standard deep network. It gets an input vector x over here as its input. This flows through tunable weighted connections in these W matrices. And at each layer, the neuron basically computes a dot product with its weights and then applies this nonlinear function, some kind of nonlinear function. And you get this cascade of nonlinear functions. So what makes this difficult to analyze mathematically is really those nonlinear functions. So one thing we can do, is quite extreme, is just to remove all of these functions and let this network be have linear mappings from inputs to outputs. So this is a deep linear network. And you may be thinking, okay, you could do that, but this would be trivial, because if you have the product of lots of linear mappings, that sort of composition of linear mappings is still just a linear mapping. So as you add more layers in this network, you could always rewrite the computation as a single shallow network. But as we'll see, it can actually massively change the learning dynamics. So it's true that the representational power doesn't increase as you add layers, but the learning dynamics will. So in some sense, the deep linear network model is controlling for representational power. It's purely looking at the effective depth of layered structure on learning dynamics. And just to convince you that these networks can do quite complex things, in the top we have a shallow network, just mapping from an input to an output, learning a task. And you can see that the trajectory it takes is a simple exponential approach to zero error. In a deep network, however, this is a deep linear network, you can see that the learning takes these sort of the form of these stages, and it sort of has these bumps as it goes down to zero error, a much more complex trajectory. So we'd like to understand exactly what this trajectory is and how it relates to the task that you're learning. So the deep linear network model in the context of semantic cognition is going to look something like this. The inputs will be these vectors that represent what you're looking at. So you could think of them as they're just a 1 for the item you're currently viewing and zeros for all of the rest. You can actually allow it to be slightly more complicated, but that's a simple way of thinking about it. And then the network will just have 2 weight matrices, just keep things simple. So there's only one hidden layer, sort of the minimally deep case. And then we have y hat here is the network's predictions of all of the properties in the world. And y will be the actual properties that you observe. So the idea is you know you're looking at a dog, maybe you see the dog move, and then you learn based on the discrepancy between your prediction and what you actually observed. And this simple model has 3 key assumptions baked in. The first is this deep layered architecture. The second is the starting point. I'm going to assume you start with no initial knowledge, so basically 0 weight. And the third is the learning mechanism, which I'll assume is gradual error corrective learning, here instantiated as gradient descent, the standard workhorse algorithm in deep learning. All right, so just to clarify again why this model gives interesting behavior, when I say it's a deep linear network, what I mean is that the mapping from the inputs x to the outputs y hat is a linear mapping. You can always write it as a one single matrix operation. But when it comes time to do learning, the way you do learning in these models is you calculate some error function, right? So here I'm going to use the squared error. And this is a squared error between the network's predictions and the actual labels provided by the environment. And now you can see that nonlinearity has re-entered this error function. And then learning corresponds to minimizing this error function by changing the weights. And this minimization problem, if you stare at it for a while, you'll see that it's in fact non-convex once you have one or more hidden layers. So this simple model still retains this key feature of the nonlinear case, which is that you're trying to solve a non-convex optimization problem, and that can change the learning dynamics. So if you just write down the gradient descent dynamics in this model, you get this messy equation. And I won't go through it in detail, but I put it up here merely to point out that as you add more layers, the dynamics get much more complicated. So for instance, you can see it requires the product of weights. So to know how to change the weights at layer L, I need to know all the other weights. So things are coupled, and the dynamics are nonlinear. You see the products of weights are occurring. You get up to cubic interactions. And the final thing to note is that in this simple deep linear case, the only way that the data or the world enters is through the input correlation matrix and the input-output correlation matrix, which appear in this equation. So our goal is going to be to solve these equations to reveal the learning trajectories as a function of the structure in the environment, which will be characterized by these two input correlation matrices. And just to say that, of course, deep linear networks are not new. There's been lots of prior work here. The critical points were worked out by Baldi and Hornick. Some shallow and three-layer dynamics have been worked out. But the main thing that we're adding is an analysis that applies to deeper networks. All right, so how can we understand the trajectory in these models? Now, this gets a little technical, but I'll go through it slowly, and feel free to ask questions. So it turns out that things simplify when you make the right change of variables. And here's essentially how it works. It's based on the singular value decomposition. So here is a little toy world that I made up. It has 4 items. They each have properties. They're sort of animals and plants. And I can take this input-output correlation matrix, which defines my world, right? It's basically saying a flower can grow, has roots, and has petals. So this is the data that the world has provided me. And I can decompose that into the product of 3 matrices. And these matrices essentially encode different aspects of this overall world structure. So if you look at the right singular vectors in this matrix over here, the first row here has positive values on all items. And so it's going to encode what's common to all of the items. And it links up to the first column here. And you can see that what's common to all the items is that they can grow. So this column is linked to this row. This next row is separating the animals from the plants. It's positive on the animals, it's negative on the plants. And it links up with the second column here, which distinguishes the items that can move from the items that have roots, and so on down this tree. And then finally, these values on the diagonal here, called the singular values, they determine the strength of this particular association in the data set. So this matrix will always be diagonal. And it turns out that the network is going to learn essentially in the same reference frame. So it's going to have these singular vector matrices, the U and the V matrices, sort of fixed there. But it's going to have potentially different values for the singular values. So at the beginning of learning, they'll all be 0. The network will represent nothing. And then over time, they'll pop up to their final values in the environment. So when you analyze things in this reference frame, the dynamics of the network turn out to be much simpler. And essentially what we're doing here is dealing with the coupling. So we used to have all of these coupled parameters, weights from every layer interacting. Now we've separated things out into a bunch of 1D chains where you get one of these chains for each singular value, and they don't interact. So that's the huge simplification that the SVD buys you. You can kind of think about them completely separately, each one of these input-output modes, as we call them. So let me see if this video comes through. I'll just show you sort of the dynamics of what happens. You can see that the singular values start off at 0 in this network, and then they slowly pop up to their correct values in the environment. And as they do, the input-output map refines over time to match what's been given in the world. So you can then go in and look at the dynamics of just one of these singular values and write down explicit equations for them as a function of the network depth. And I won't go through those in detail, but I'll just plot them for you. And you can see that there's a qualitative change between the shallow and the deep networks. So in the shallow networks, we see that each singular value just exponentially approaches its asymptotic value. Whereas in a deep network, you see these sigmoidal transitions. So this means there's this long period where apparently you're not learning anything, and then a relatively brief transition to mastering this one particular dimension of your world. And the very deep networks look basically the same, it's just slightly different shape to the transition. So because you can consider each of these singular values independently, that equation describes to each one of them, and you can reconstruct the full dynamics for the network. And so, for instance, if you have a number of singular values in a shallow network, you get exponential approach for all of them. In the deep network, you get sigmoidal transitions for all of them. And in the red here, I'm showing you the results of simulating neural networks from small random weights. There are a few approximations involved in this analysis that I haven't focused on, but you can see that the simulations of real deep networks match up with this theory. Okay, so once you have these solutions, you can ask whichever questions you like. And one simple one is, well, how long does it take to learn a particular association in the environment? And the answer that falls out is that each of these singular value dimensions is learned in time proportional to 1 over the singular value. So this is just formalizing the very straightforward idea that the stronger a statistical association in the environment, the faster you learn it, quantified by the singular value. All right, so to summarize this picture of the dynamics emerging in deep linear networks, it's really depth itself. That's one thing that surprised me. The stage-like shape to these curves, the sigmoidal shape of these curves, is coming just from the fact that we have deep chain-like structure. It doesn't depend on nonlinearities because we don't have any neural nonlinearities anywhere in here. So it's depth itself that strongly impacts learning dynamics. It creates these sigmoidal trajectories. Learning speed is strongly ordered by singular value strength. And I just want to mention that I've only been describing training error. If you're interested in generalization error, there's some other nice papers on that. It's much more complex. All right, so now let's use these solutions to see what they would imply for human semantic development if it worked in this sort of simple deep network style. So to do this, we're going to take that deep linear network, but now we're going to hook it up to a richer environment. And in particular, I'm going to assume that the world is given by some structured probabilistic generative model. So here, maybe it's a hierarchy. And you can then draw data from this generative model and then feed that data set to the deep linear network. And the advantage here is we know that all we need to know about this data set in order to understand how the deep linear network will learn about it is this singular value decomposition. So there are a number of generative models for which we know the singular value decomposition of the data coming out of them in the infinite data limit. And so this gives us a mathematical link between the structure in the environment and the learning dynamics that the deep network will undergo. So here are some examples of this analysis. In the top row here, I'm showing the structure of the generative model. So the dots are different items in the world, and the items that are close to each other in the graph are more likely to share properties than items that are far apart. So this case, you have 3 different clusters of items. When you look at the similarity of their properties, you can generate this item covariance matrix. You can see that they block into these 3 different clusters. Here now is the singular vectors from that sort of the input analyzer singular vectors on the rightmost side. And you can see that it splits out the 3 clusters. The first 3 singular vectors pick out 3 clusters. And if you then, that means they'll be learned first, and that's how the network will organize its internal representation. And if you plot an internal, like a 2D embedding of the neural network's activity, you can see that things split out into 3 clusters. Pretty straightforward. If you learn about a tree, things get a little more complex. The covariance matrix will be ultrametric. That's this sort of nested hierarchical structure. And you can see that the singular vectors mirror this hierarchy. So you get one for everything, then splitting the animals from the plants, say, and so on down the tree. And when you embed the hidden representations in the 2D, you can see that they elaborate out this tree structure. Chains give circulant matrices with Fourier transforms, sort of wave-like singular vectors, and so on. So this is sort of a simple window into how these deep networks, into how these deep networks will represent and learn about structure. So how can we link this back to empirical observations? Well, one phenomenon we can look at is progressive differentiation, which I mentioned at the start. And that's the observation that children often learn about high-level distinctions like animal versus plant before lower-level distinctions like dog versus cat. As you know, it's difficult to measure these things. This is not, this is a slightly contested point experimentally. But nevertheless, we can ask, how might this occur? And in deep networks, it arises quite naturally, because suppose you're looking at some hierarchy like this. Well, we know that the correlation matrix of the properties for these different items is going to have this ultrametric structure. And we know that ultrametric matrices, just turns out, this is a fact from linear algebra, are diagonalized by the Haar wavelets, which are these singular vectors, essentially, which exactly mirror the tree structure. So the point is that the modes that the SVD picks out, which is what the deep linear network will learn, perfectly conform to the tree structure. And we can also characterize the set of generative models that will have a decreasing singular value as a function of hierarchy level. So the largest singular value is for what all of the items share. The next one is for the plant-animal distinction, and so on down the tree. And so this will necessarily start with the broadest distinctions and then elaborate out the other ones over time. And so here's sort of a little movie of this happening. On the left, I'm showing the, on the left, I'm showing the different singular values popping up in the deep linear network. And on the right, I'm showing the 2D embedding of the network's representation. And you can see that it elaborates out the tree, but in these sort of stage-like transitions. So first you learn what's common to everything, then you split off the animals versus plants, and then you split off the finer distinctions, and so on. So this fact was observed in simulation by Tim Rogers and Jay McClelland. And they were just simulating nonlinear deep networks, and they observed this progressive differentiation. And now we're in a position to sort of better understand where that's coming from in this environment, how it links to the environmental structure. And in fact, this whole project was motivated by this brilliant book by Tim Rogers and Jay McClelland on semantic cognition, where they used nonlinear networks to show all of the phenomena I'm showing you. And we're just sort of coming through that with a new mathematical analysis that formalizes some of these insights. All right, here's another phenomenon that this network can exhibit. If you go to a small child at the right age and you say, does a worm have bones? There's an age where they might say yes. Now, no worm has bones, so they could never have seen this. So where did they get this idea from? And Susan Carey, the developmental psychologist at Harvard, has pointed out that this is quite a challenge for simple association accounts of development. If all you do is associate items with their properties, how could you ever come up with this illusory belief about an item? But it turns out that deep networks exhibit exactly this phenomenon. So here is the activation on the y-axis of a property like has bones for an item like worm. And you can see that, in fact, it has this U-shaped trajectory. So there's this transient period of time where this particular network is getting this particular property wrong before eventually it gets it right at the end of learning. And the reason is fairly straightforward. In red, I'm plotting the contributions from each of the singular value modes. You can see that essentially the first two are contributing in the wrong direction, but the third sort of cleans things up and contributes in the right direction, and then they cancel each other out. And so essentially what's happening is, because most animals have bones and a worm is an animal, you say, well, probably a worm has bones. So you get this transient overgeneralization on the specific property that's then corrected by some of the later information. And it turns out that shallow networks, you can prove they never exhibit this. So they only have flat predictions for this feature. And this, I think, vindicates Sue Carey's point that a simple associationist account cannot give you these illusory correlations. But interestingly, once you add depth, you can start getting these U-shaped, inverted U-shaped dynamics of learning. Another phenomenon we can look at is category coherence. So this is the observation that, for instance, the category of birds seems quite natural to us, but the category of things that are yellow and less than 3 years old has probably never really come up for you. And there's lots of empirical work showing that coherent categories are learned very quickly. So how will deep linear networks learn about sort of rich categories like this? What makes a category coherent? Well, here's a world that I've just made up. It has a bunch of features and a bunch of objects. And you can see that there's no obvious structure in this matrix for us. But if I just train a deep network on this set of items and features, you can see that over time, the items separate out into 3 clusters. And if I then reorder that matrix by those identified clusters, you can see that, in fact, there were 3 clusters that I sort of hid in this matrix where items in this cluster are more likely to share features, or items in this cluster are more likely to share features, and so on. And so in this sort of toy model, I can embed clusters of different sizes. I can have different probabilities that they'll share features and so on. And you can get a range of different curves for when you will detect that feature. So here we're measuring detection as the overlap between the internal representation of that particular cluster and sort of the ideal one that I know about because I embedded the cluster myself. So overlap of 1 means you perfectly recovered it, and 0 means you have absolutely no recovery. And you get all of these different curves. The picture looks very complicated. But it turns out in this model, there's a quantity that you can calculate, which I'll call category coherence, where if I just replot these curves according to this category coherence metric, then all of a sudden, all of these observations collapse onto one universal performance curve. And you can see that for low category coherences, you get no recovery of the category. And then there's this critical category coherence value of 1, where recovery starts, and then it improves monotonically after that. And the actual definition is given here. So it involves the signal to noise. That's like how likely are the items to share features versus the background. And then the product of the number of objects and features that are in a category. So this is a sort of simple metric that captures a lot of, I think, intuitive notions of what makes a category coherent. It needs to be a joint group of objects and features that are strongly linked. And here, this category coherence is just the singular value. And so we know it links to learning speed. Lastly, we can sort of peer inside the deep network. So far, I've mostly been talking about behavior. When does it learn categories, so on. But we can also ask, what are the neural representations like in this hidden layer in the deep network? What would you expect to measure in fMRI, for instance? And one question you can ask is, suppose I train two networks in the same environment. What can I measure about their hidden representations, which would be invariant to the fact that, in detail, they might have different neural mappings because of random initializations, but still they were trained in the same environment. So here's an example. If you just train two deep linear networks on the exact same task, in these two panels, I'm showing you the detailed neural activity in response to 4 items. So this is a toy data set with just 4 items. And there's 32 neurons. And if you look at these, you find that there's no way to line these up. It's not as though there's some neuron in this network that has the exact same response as this neuron in that network. In fact, in detail, they're completely different at the level of neural tuning. But if you calculate the representational similarity, so here the neural correlation, this is like a representational similarity analysis, then you see that these two networks, in fact, have exactly identical representational similarity matrices, and you can prove this for deep linear networks, starting from small initializations. Another thing is that the neural correlations, which has this hierarchical structure, also mirrors the behavioral correlations. So this has been observed empirically. There's this link between neural correlations and behavioral correlations. It doesn't need to be the case, but if you train a deep network, it turns out it will be the case, at least in these simple deep linear networks. So here's some example data. This is looking at representations of different items in monkey IT using a representational dissimilarity matrix, and also human IT using fMRI. And you can see that these two matrices look relatively similar. So there was a time when people said, okay, well, presumably this reflects shared evolutionary heritage. But our results are suggesting that an alternative, they're not mutually exclusive, but an alternative would be that monkeys and humans share enough in their environment that through learning, they would also be arriving at a similar representational similarity. And just to say that it may seem like these results are inevitable, but if you start with large random weights, then you see something completely different. So in fact, you only get conserved representational similarity for networks that start with very small weights. If you start them with large weights, you can see that there's no consistency between different solutions, and there's no consistency between the neural correlations of behavior, even though these networks are all doing the behavior perfectly. The point is there's lots of freedom to represent this task in these networks, and only the ones that start from small weights, that they obey this sort of approximate efficiency principle of finding the minimum weight implementation of this input-output mapping, and only then do you see this conservation. All right. So now that we've seen a little bit about the internal structure in these networks, we can turn to the empirical observations about inductive generalization. So this is asking, how can you use your knowledge that you've learned to generalize to a new situation rapidly? So for instance, suppose I tell you in an experiment, I just say, a dog has property X, some new property you've never heard of. A dog has enzyme 37. How are you going to extend that property to all of the other items in your world? So a simple way you can do this is you take this network, you add an additional output node for this new property X, and then you train just these weights from the hidden layer to that output node, and now you can then test all the other items, the degree to which this output node is activated. And what this network is going to do, turns out, is it takes this property and it embeds it into the representational space of the network near the item that you've specified. So if this is the dog item, then property X will get embedded into the internal representation nearby the dog, and generalization will follow that similarity gradient. So the items closest in the hierarchy will be very likely to have property X, and the items farther away will be less likely. And so if you imagine doing this at different points in training, because of progressive differentiation, if you do it early in training, right, you're going to be nearby to all of the items. So you're going to generalize this property to many items. And then after the first wave of differentiation between animals and plants, now you're going to put the property nearby only the animals or the plants. And so the generalization sort of restricts a bit. And it continues to restrict down this hierarchy. So you get this pattern of decreasing field of generalization over time, which has also been observed in human development. And as we saw, if you start these networks from large weights, the internal similarity structure can be very different. And so here, for instance, is what happens if you just tried some random network with starting from large weights and ran the same sort of inductive generalization procedure. You can see it does not even respect the tree, right? So here, the generalizations you're making reflect the idiosyncrasies of that internal transformation and don't nicely mirror this hierarchy that we've embedded in this world. So this is one reason why you might prefer these sort of efficient solutions to start from small weights, is they support generalization better. Okay, so to summarize, gradual learning in a deep network can learn about these structured domains. And I think it's quite important to emphasize that this is from incremental experience, right? So the network, all it's doing is the same thing again and again and again. It sees an item, it makes a bunch of predictions, and it learns based on the difference between those predictions and the outcome. So this is something that you can really do online, right? You see a dog, you do some learning. You see a rabbit, you do some learning. It doesn't require storing everything. And a lot of prior approaches, like the Bayesian approaches, are very powerful, but you would need to store all of your experience and keep rerunning this complicated Bayesian inference model. So I do think this one interesting feature is that you can extract this rich domain structure just by lots of incremental updates in these deep networks. And I've shown that these deep linear network models are in fact exactly solvable. So you can describe how the trajectories unfold. And that gives us a tractable window into development. And I think it's sort of amazing, still amazing to me, that this is a very simple model, but you get these sort of complex dynamical trajectories out, even with a completely static environment, right? So if you're learning from an environment that's structured as a tree, you get these progressive waves of differentiation that elaborate down the tree structure. And all of that comes even though you're always looking at the exact same environment. And I've shown or sort of hinted that this theory can give a quantitative account of several different phenomena like category coherence, progressive differentiation. I didn't talk about all of the things that this model can address. It can also address typicality and prototype effects. So what makes a bird, like which birds are the most typical birds. It can also address basic level effects. And I guess I did talk about neural representations a bit. And if you're curious to read more, you can look at this. The first reference here is sort of the bulk of what I've been describing. The second reference with Zara Sadehi and Jay McClellan was sort of looking at a subtlety, which is that, if you think about the Bayesian approaches, they sort of have to fit an exact hierarchy, or at least so far, many of them, that has been their approach. So they fit these pure structural forms, whereas the neural network, although it can learn pure structural forms, it can also learn sort of messy things that aren't quite any one structural form. So the more mathematical details of the solutions are in this last paper. All right, so with that, let's just acknowledge my collaborators on this, James McCullen and Surya Ganguly. It's just a wonderful collaboration. And give thanks to the lab members who've supported this work and my funding. And I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Doctor. We have two questions in question and answer in the Zoom application. You can see them if you click on the question and answer part, or I can read them to you if you want.
I feel like this should be working. Do I have to stop sharing my screen, or?
I believe you should firstly
sorry, there
stop
it is.
sharing. Good.
All right. So, yeah, this is a great question. When you said it is better to start with small weights, is there a threshold for distinguishing between large and small weights? Yeah, I should probably think more about this. I do think, so first of all, it is a somewhat smooth transition. It's not like a step change. And I think, but I haven't really gone through it in detail, that essentially it has to be much smaller than the size of the singular value that you're eventually going to learn. So I know that's not super satisfying, but at least gives you some sense. So if you start initializing with matrices, for instance, suppose you're learning a data set where the singular values are 3 or 2 or 1, then the initial singular values in your weight matrices that they're starting from should be like 0.3, 0.2, 0.1, not almost the same. And the technical reason, maybe I'll just say this quickly, is that one of the assumptions, which I didn't talk about behind this whole analysis, is that when you do this change of variables, in general, this matrix won't start off perfectly diagonal. There's no reason it has to. So these off-diagonal elements can be large. If you start from small weights, it just turns out that things rapidly decouple and it becomes diagonal very quickly. But if you start with very large weights, then that's no longer the case. And you have to account for these interaction effects. So the dynamics look very different. For instance, even in very deep networks, you just get simple exponential approach. So the weight scale has a massive effect on this. This is also related to, if you've seen the work on the sort of mean field regime versus the neural tangent kernel regime. This is the difference between feature learning and lazy learning in the deep linear network case. All right. Second question, is the relationship of neurons modeled by Markov process? Well, time hasn't, in what I've described, time doesn't really, I kind of ignore time, which, obviously it's important, but here we're just imagining that all you see is sort of a static snapshot of there's a dog, and the neurons don't have temporal dynamics within a trial. It's just, so time for me is just learning time. So, like months of experiencing the world. If that didn't answer your question, I'm not sure I know that. You can also ask it again. And final question, you talked about some advantages of the linear model. Doesn't this cause a simpler cost function? Yes. So I've been focusing on the advantages of linear model, but of course there's huge disadvantages. The most central being it doesn't work, right? You can't actually use this to do ImageNet or some other real world task. And that is a real limitation. And I think, there's always going to be some trade-off between generality and tractability. And for different questions, you're going to need to sit at different points on that trade-off. But I guess my view of how this would work is, much as in physics, if you think of the gas laws in physics that describe pressure and volume, those are very simplified descriptions of complex interactions that are actually occurring between particles in a gas. But in a certain regime, they're very valuable. And I think that's analogous to these deep linear networks. They describe not all phenomena in deep networks by a long shot, but they do describe a particular small limited regime in some of the phenomena that occur in deep networks. And so, yeah, it's not a general solution.
Thank you very much. I have another question from you. Actually, you present the properties with a matrix. What if we present the properties with higher order matrices like tensors, and we do the decomposition for that structure?
Yeah.
I think that it has more interpretability. I don't know, maybe.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting direction. I haven't looked too much into that direction. The only thing I would say is that there's a set of phenomena which we can't capture with the deep linear network, which are basically contextual interactions. So the original, this is the nonlinear network that Tim and Jay McCullen simulated. I can see it actually has two layers. It has the input layer and also has this contextual relation layer. The idea is that sometimes you want to know that a canary, what can a canary do? But other times you may want to know what a canary is or what a canary has. And so these are different contexts that you can access your information in, which requires nonlinearity now to implement these cross terms. And so I do think there's probably a way to switch to tensors where now you have the bilinear forms, but I haven't looked at that. I think that would be very interesting.
Thank you very much for your interesting presentation and your complete answer to our questions.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Doctor. So with this, I believe if there are any other questions, please do ask. Let's wait if there are any other questions. So it seems that it's finished. Thank you, Doctor, for joining us today. It was an honor having you here.
My pleasure. Stay safe, everyone.
Thank you. You too.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.